There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
What a special treat to have Maria from Dublin back. Maria, hello.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm great. It's so nice to see you. You put out a few videos since you last talked to me, so your channel is an intermittent joy.
Yes, very intermittent at the moment, very busy with life stuff.
Very intermittent and still very joyous. So we're going to talk about a book that you have already, I think, called your book of the year. It's an Irish novel called Trespasses by Louise Kennedy.
Yeah.
It's just new out, isn't it, this year?
It is, yeah.
So it's got a 4.45 rating on Goodreads with 223 ratings. So that's pretty darn good.
That's pretty good. It's pretty impressive, isn't it?
It is. Tell us about the book.
It is a book that is a very non-Maria book. It is basically a love story set in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I avoid books about the Trouble like the plague. And I avoid love stories like the plague. And it's even a love, it's more of an affair between a young woman and a married man. But it's very much a love story between the two of them. Louise Kennedy's writing blew me away. I knew I would like her from the beginning, from her short story collection. So I pre-ordered this book. And yeah, she made me break all my rules to read a book I wouldn't normally read. And I just loved the way that she tells the story in her prose.
Awesome. Her short story collection is intriguingly titled "The End of the World is a Cul-de-sac." And that one had been on my radar, but I hadn't gotten to it yet. And I was curious about it and Trespasses. I see several Goodreads reviews, most of which are overwhelmingly positive reviews, but some of which are negative, that say that her prose style is a little peculiar.
Yes, it is. And that's what I like about it. So if you like her short story collection or dislike her short story collection for her prose style, if you read that first, because that came out last year, or if you read this novel and you want to know about her short story collection, her prose style remains the same. She talks about very ordinary things. She is a chef by trade, and she will talk about cooking pasta and the pasta sticking while telling you a very important part of the plot. And she's very, very normal, composed writing. She is, this is her debut novel. She's in her early 50s, and I think her age tells she's just very comfortable with her own writing. So yeah, actually, if you did your 112 page tag, you would know if you liked her writing.
Great.
I think.
Or a Kindle preview for an ebook preview or something. It's great.
Absolutely. Yeah,
or whatever, get access to that. And I've seen her writing style also described as hazy.
Hazy, yeah. I actually think it's kind of the opposite. I actually picked up an important part of the book from that paragraph, from the way that she describes something, that this person it's a scene where she's driving down the street. She's talking about how she's going down past the different houses and how the house has changed. And she's describing Belfast in 1975. Or Northern Ireland 1975. And she's describing how the coloured flags of the Protestants with the Union Jacks would have flown and how pretty it was, and yet in the same paragraph she's still saying how it's a dull rainy day. There's this puddle outside of a chipper shop, and then how she splashes this young boy who just then looks down at himself. And that's some really key important character, and that's how she does her writing. So I suppose you could call that hazy, but I call that a big build up to exactly the most important person, or one of the two more important people that are going to our main character Cushla is going to meet in this book.
Well, tell us a little bit more about Cushla.
Cushla, yeah, it's Cushla McCree. It's an expression. It's the pulse of my heart, or the beat of my heart. It's described in the book. Cushla is Irish Catholic in Northern Ireland, 1975, living in a predominantly Protestant town, and her family owns the local pub. And we're mostly Protestants in it. And the Troubles are going on, and she's also a teacher in a Catholic school. And she meets a married Protestant barrister, older than herself, and basically has an affair with him over the course of the novel, while working in the school with this young boy, which I sort of indicated in the opening paragraph for him, who is having family problems in his family at the same time. So it's very much the relationship between her and the child, and her and this affair.
And it's sounding to me like a character-driven novel. Would that be fair?
It's extremely character-driven. It's based around Cushla and her feelings, but it's also Northern Ireland becomes another character, and the Troubles become another character in the novel on how she deals with this.
Sounds like a Sean book.
Yes. The Troubles are extremely well described in this book, for once. It's a difficult thing to describe, and the difficult relationships, the normal everyday life that happens in it. So I think an awful lot of people will always not like it, because it was a difficult time for a lot of people.
Lots of foreshadowing of bad things to come. We're not going to talk
bad
about
things, bad things happening, like an Irish Catholic having an affair with a married Protestant man in 1975. It's never going to end well, and everybody knows it from the beginning, including Cushla. It can never end well.
Offline, you told me some interesting, quite moving stuff about the author, Louise Kennedy. Tell us about her.
Louise Kennedy is a chef by trade. A chef, yeah. So there is an awful lot of descriptions of food in the book, but ordinary food, and it's always very important to what's actually happening at the time. But she was diagnosed with cancer just before she wrote her book and her novel and her short stories. So it made her get the finger out, as we say, and to make sure that, it pushed her to write them. And we're very, very privileged that she did, because if she had continued just working as a chef, we would have lost quite a couple of very good books, and a couple of new ones that she has halfway written at the moment. She's still struggling with her cancer diagnosis. Yeah.
She didn't really begin to write, or at least not to write in a serious kind of focused way, until after her diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, I presume she was always writing, and most people do. Yeah, but it forced her to publish. Yeah, to write in such a way that she would publish.
Is there anything you'd like to add about why you love this book so much, despite your reservations going in?
It is the prose of Louise Kennedy and her ability to create character. You should not want some of the things the characters are doing, but you totally understand. And just the description that everybody around them, that some of them do horrendous things. There is also, which I haven't mentioned, is a really funny sense of humor from Northern Ireland. It is actually, so it is bleak, but it is also very funny. I mean, there's news forecasts, and they're in the pub, and they're all listening to the news forecast, and the news report. And the terrible incendiary bomb, these horrible words. And then there's this article about streaking. So they're all been in this pub, not arguing over any politics, but there's a item about streaking, and that's when somebody walks off, because they can't agree whether streaking is a funny thing or a horrendous thing to be doing. So it's that kind of humor all the way through the novel as well.
And I just want to make sure that I caught that. So a streaker, someone running around naked, right?
Naked, yeah. It was a big thing to do in the 1970s in Ireland and Britain for some reason. They did it during Wimbledon and everything. It was one of those things that were done.
That were done, or that Maria perhaps did as well?
I was only 5 in 1975. So.
Well, you were probably...
I probably did.
The rest of them. That's fantastic, Maria. I am sold. I can't wait to read it myself. Thank you so much for telling us about it.
Okay.
I'm here with a new guest for Bite Size Book Chats. This is Annie from Utah, and the CEO of a fabulous literary blog called A Bookish Type. And she is here with her partner in crime, Ari. Annie, welcome.
Hi, Sean.
Annie and I were just talking, and we're not sure who followed who first or where we found each other, but I follow her blog, and she tweets about her blog entries. And it was a review that she wrote in early April
of this novel that caught my eye, and I invited her, and she accepted the invitation. So lucky me. The novel is called How to Be Eaten. We're going to talk about that title eventually, by Maria Adelmann. Annie, tell us the opening premise. What is this book about?
I love the premise of this book, where it takes place after a lot of events that are slowly revealed throughout the course of the novel. We have a group of 5 women who are emailed about a therapy opportunity. And at first, a lot of them are very reluctant. Their stories have been told in the press. They've been talked about on social media. And most of the time, they're just like, no, I don't want to be back in the spotlight. But they kind of eventually get worn down, and they're like, okay, if it's not going to be filmed, we'll just talk to a therapist. I'll finally get a chance to get my story out. And as the characters start to reveal their stories, it's really easy to start to draw connections between the characters' names and what happens to them and certain fairy tales that are pretty popular in Western culture.
So this is a good place for me early in the conversation, and we didn't talk about this before, so I will spring this on you. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to convince me that despite my fairly pronounced allergy to fairy tales in fiction, that I should give this book a try. Are you up for that?
Oh, I certainly hope so, because I want to do the book justice. So there are very few actual fantastical elements in this story. Rather, the elements of the original fairy tales have been transformed into events, like in the case of the character named Ashley, who is on a Bacheloresque kind of show called The One. She is kind of pulled out of obscurity to go off to a fantastical mansion where she has a chance at love with a very rich man. She has a fairy godmother character who's actually a publicist who kind of coaches her along in the story. So there's no like actual fairy tale elements in that particular one, or there are ways of telling these backstories that could either be mental illness or true crime even, or just a story that's been told so many times that it starts to kind of lose its sharp edges a little bit. Just setting aside the few fantastical elements, it's like, I could see how you would think that something magical happened, but there's also an interpretation where there's nothing magical at all.
It's more psychologized or something.
It could be, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm feeling more comfortable already.
All right.
And so these women, you've mentioned in your review and the Goodreads synopsis, all mentioned about them having been in the public eye. So are they all some sort of famous 15 minutes of fame type of characters?
More in the 15 minutes of fame category, and none of them for good reasons.
Okay.
This is kind of why they've been shying away from the media. They don't want their stories out there again, because a lot of them mention that when they go out into the streets, people recognize them and kind of no, I know you from somewhere. And they're like, weren't you in that tabloid a while ago? Or didn't something horrible happen to you in the past? Because some of them, like I mentioned, the true crime a little bit, like this is obviously fiction, but some of them get involved in stories that, if they were real, would definitely be podcast fodder for, the usual true crime kind of podcasts.
They've all kind of been touched with some kind of a scandal or something like that. So what do you want to say about the therapist that convinces them all to join his group?
Yeah, at first, not much is said about him in the book, but in the way that the other characters start to slowly reveal their backstories and stuff like that, you start to get hints about there's something going on with this therapist. And I initially had the question of why is he even doing this? Because it seems like there's no benefit to it, obviously, and very few characters in fiction are purely altruistic. If they are, they're actually in the original fairy tales, to be honest. And so as his story starts to come out, you start to see these little interstitial moments where you're like, okay, he's doing something. He's there for a reason. He's collecting these stories for a reason. And then that, along with one of the women's in the group, her story starts to converge with his a little bit. But that's where I want to say I would ruin it if I said any more.
And you're doing a fabulous job of staying away from spoilers. There's so much about this so far that is already screaming gender. And the fact
absolutely.
And the fact that the therapist is male and all of the members of the therapy group are female.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting juxtaposition where they have this male character as the therapist who's asking these questions and clearly directing conversation to whatever ends he has. And yet for the women, it's a chance for them to finally tell their story, to finally explain, no, here's how I got involved. I'm not culpable in this horrible scandal, or I didn't know that my story was going to be told this way.
Used
and so they,
in that way, or yes.
Yeah, because as soon as their stories got out into social media, everybody else's experience started to color those versions of it where, you know, one character gets involved in a horrific crime and everybody starts to go, oh, she knew what was going to happen. She was clearly an accomplice. Or what we know about reality show with the reality show character where it's like, oh, we knew it's all staged, but she didn't. I really like that they finally get the chance to tell their story, even if this therapist is up to something.
Now, you said offline that there were a couple of the women, female characters that were more of a major characters. Do you want to say a little bit more about those two?
Yeah, so one of them is Ashley, the reality star character. She kind of kicks things off at the very beginning in telling these stories because, you know, she's used to the attention, so she's a little bit more, you know, willing to open up. But then there's another character who is an antagonistic character, even if she's not the actual antagonist of the story, because she has been in it longer than any of the other ones. Her story has been floating around so much, it's almost an urban legend. Her antagonism towards the therapist and towards some of the other characters is an amazing catalyst for keeping the story going in an incredibly realistic way, because she just needles people until they stop being silent, until they finally reveal the actual truth. And they kind of carry the action for a lot of the book until the big twist. So,
okay, well, you sure know how to hook me, so I'm very curious. I'm going to take a stab at interpreting the title and tell me if I'm completely off base. So the title is really enigmatic: How to Be Eaten. So the way that their stories, their experiences have been consumed by culture, is that kind of what it's about?
That's a big part of it. Yeah, so I think a lot of it is that way, where we're just constantly consuming these stories in our news, in our social media, without really thinking about, well, how did the people get there? What are their actual motivations? Why is the story told this way or that way? There's also, with the references to fairy tales, some very literal, or at least close to literal versions of how to be eaten, because two of the stories that are referenced are Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood.
Yes.
And I love when a book has layers like that, so you can keep digging into it, because those fairy tales are also stories that we consume and we respin based on, you know, our own experiences or what we want that story to tell. They could be a cautionary tale, they could be a story of hope. So it's all these different layers of stories being consumed, eaten, and then being asked as a reader to think about, well, what's the price for the person in the story?
Absolutely. I didn't realize until about 5 seconds ago that this book has not yet been published. So you read an advance copy.
I did. That's why I don't have an actual copy of it. It's a digital copy. It should be coming out
May
fairly
31st, May 31st, according to Goodreads, but who knows?
I jumped ahead in my list. Yeah.
No worries. So that's when I'll put it up, just before then. It depends where you live and what publisher it is in your jurisdiction. But
I think the other thing I would say is maybe avoid the temptation to race through it, because one of my big issues is when I get excited about a book, I just inhale it, and then I'm like, I want to go back to the beginning and get everything again for the first time. But because there's so much going on in this book, I would say slow down, take some breaks, think about what you just read, look for connections with previous stories that you might remember from when you were a kid, or if you've read Angela Carter, The Bloody Chamber, which is one of the first books that's like a retelling of fairy tales that I love. It was parts, but slow down and kind of resist that temptation, because there's going to be so much that just filters up from, you know, your cultural background and your experience or non-experience with social media and things like that. So avoid that temptation and let the book speak to you.
And if you cannot avoid that temptation, then read it a second time.
Oh, yeah.
See what you get. Yeah, it sounds like a book that would repay a reread. Annie, what an awesome guest you are. Well, I hope you'll come back.
Oh, yeah, I'd be delighted to come back.
Sisilia, welcome back.
Hello, Sean. How are you?
I'm great. And I should say that Sisilia is joining us from Singapore. And we're here to talk about the Seaniest of Sean books, I think. I don't think she's going to have too much trouble selling me on it. It is a 1931 novel from the UK called The Fortnight in September by R.C. Sherriff. And there she's got a copy. Tell us about it, Sisilia.
Okay. This is a very interesting. Okay, first of all, this cover design sold the book to me first.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. It's by Scribner. It was only released last year. And I read this book in September. So it's just a perfect timing. The Fortnight in September is about an English family, a British family. It's called the Stevens. So the Stevenses, they have this annual pilgrimage to the beach. Every year they have a holiday. And I guess everybody can relate to the family. And I mean, considering that with COVID, we can't go traveling, right? This book is really, really like an escapism. It's a perfect. The story is so relatable. I guess like you guys know how it feels to, prepare for a holiday. It's like the anxiety and the expectation of going for a holiday. Just wondering if everything will be perfect and what to do during this the holiday period. And as usual, sometimes we forget about our usual life, and sometimes we just reflect about our life during the holiday. And that's what the Stevenses do. Every one of them, every single member of their family, they have kind of a reflection about their life. Yeah, so it's a simple story about a family going for holiday, but deeper inside, we get to know of each individual member of the family, the anxiety, the loneliness, the hope for the future. And again, as a wrap up, when the holiday ends, then, I have to go back to work. That feeling is so familiar to every one of us.
Very relatable.
Yes. So I guess it's a perfect novel to be read annually, I think.
It was published in 1931. So the setting, does it feel like an interwar novel?
You don't really have a feel of it. It's supposed to be like an escapism for those people who went to the war. Right. This was written for that purpose.
Tell us a little bit about the members of the family.
Basically, parents with two kids, Mary and Dick. Mr. Stevens, I guess he's the core of the family, like the central character here. And he's just so anxious, about his job and whether he's doing the right thing for the family. Mrs. Stevens, she's just detached. She's just being away. She likes to be alone, doing her own stuff. And of course, with the children.
How old are the children?
Okay, Mary is 20-year-old and Dick is 17.
So almost not children. So, okay.
Yeah. So I guess when they grow to enter adulthood, then there is an anxiety on how they perform. For example, the son, he managed to get a job. So he questioned himself whether he's going to be capable in this job, whether he lives up to the parents' expectation. It's just a normal
everyday middle class feeling. White people's problems.
Yes, yep. Exactly.
And so, the daughter?
In this story is she's meeting with new friends. So she starts comparing her life and this newly found friend. And when you start comparing your life to another person's life, and then there's some disappointment arise.
Sure.
Yeah.
And how about the tone of the novel? Is it comedic, bittersweet, dramatic? Maybe not dramatic, I will guess.
No, it's not dramatic. It's very calm. It's similar to Elizabeth Taylor. Kind of, it's a subtle notes of Elizabeth Taylor.
It does very much sound like a book that I would like. So Sisilia, thanks for telling us about it.
Thank you.
What a delight to welcome a brand new guest to Bite Size Book Chats. We have been Litsy friends for years. Holly from Hawaii. Hello, Holly.
Hi.
Welcome, welcome. We have been commenting and liking and giving thumbs up on each other's posts, and here we are. You have recently read a book that is one that I've been really fascinated about since I first heard about it. It's new from this year. A nonfiction book called Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation by Maud Newton. Now, did you love it or like it?
Probably somewhere between the two. I don't know that I'd quite say I loved it. I definitely liked it. I liked it a lot. Let's put it that way.
Well, then let's put it that way. And please tell us about the book.
Maud Newton is a woman who grew up in the South, and she grew up in an interesting family. And what I mean by that is that her father was a raging racist. And this was very clear to her from when she was young. Things like saying that slavery was good because it was good for everybody. It was good for Black people. And it was very clear to her even as a child that something was wrong with this. And then her mother had this sort of zealotry towards religion. And it starts to come about that this probably is a mental illness situation for her, which is not to say that the two are related, but in this case they were. So as she's growing up with this environment, eventually her parents do split. She's learning more about her family. She thinks of her dad's side as the bad side and her mom's side as the good side. And she starts to learn more about her family. And she learns that there's so much more nuance to it than that there's positives in her father's family, there's negatives in her mother's family. There's an anecdote she tells early about how she knew somebody in her family had murdered someone, killed him with some sort of farming tool, like a hook. And so she always had assumed that this was, that he targeted this man and murdered him. But then when she learned about the story and started delving into her own history, she learned that no, actually, he was defending himself and someone else when this guy came after him, and it ended up this man was killed. And it got her to thinking about that we have these ideas of what happened and how things were, and then there's the reality, and they don't always mesh up. And so it really made her think, and then that's sort of the jumping off point that she starts the book with.
I was a zealot about genealogy as a teenager, actually. In fact, by the time I graduated high school, I was accredited as a professional genealogist.
Wow.
And then I kind of retired once I got into university and discovered alcohol and dating and, partying. I kind of left it behind, but I still am interested in it. But this is more than the story of her family, isn't it? Because she takes it at least a step further, probably several steps further. What can you tell us about that part of the book?
Well, what she's talking about with her family and her own history is, what does that mean about who we are? Does our family's history, do our genetics, do they determine who we are? And also, how do we reckon with the negativity that we find in our family's history? Because nobody has a perfect past family. There's always going to be bad stuff in there. And what does that mean about us? Does it have to mean anything about us? How do we grapple with those things that are in our family's past, in our own minds, in order to be okay with the fact that they did happen, but that they aren't us as we are? She's very nuanced about it, which I really appreciate, because I feel like in our world, there's so little focus on nuance and so much focus on binary. And everything is nuanced. And when we focus on binary, we lose everything. And so that's what I really appreciated most about this book, is how nuanced she was and how thoughtful she was in exploring these things and looking at how maybe the past reflects on now and how it doesn't maybe reflect on now.
The second part of the subtitle is A Reckoning and a Reconciliation. I'm curious about the reconciliation. I can't quite visualize what that might have been, what that might be like in the book.
I think the reconciliation component is where she, in her own mind, is reconciling the things that are in her past or in her family's past with who she is and how she thought of them. For example, there was a writer in her past who, and she knew this woman was a writer, and actually her birth name is Rebecca. And she chose to take the name Maud as her pen name. Her last name has always been Newton. And Maud was the name of one of her ancestors. And so she chose that name out of the past. But then when she learned more about this woman, she discovered that this woman was not a good person. She had very bad ideas about other people, about how the way of the world should be. And it was not at all what this Maud was expecting. So in her own mind, she had to then reconcile, okay, I've chosen this name and in a way thought I was modeling myself after this woman who was a writer at a time when most women didn't have that opportunity. And yet she had these virulently, racist and classist ideas and was not at all what Maud wanted reflected in herself. So I think that's where a lot of the reconciliation comes in, is acknowledging the negatives and the bads and the wrongs in the past and reconciling that with the fact that, yes, they did happen. And yes, they're part of the past, and let's acknowledge them, but not take them on to ourselves, kind of thing.
So you said at the beginning of this chat that you didn't quite love it. Why not?
There were a few things that I feel like it could have benefited from. So there's some parts of it where there's some repetition that's unnecessary. And it's just things like, at one point she mentions the 4 humors, the black bile, yellow bile, blood, phlegm. And then it explains what they are. And then 2 pages later, she's doing the same thing. And I'm sitting here saying, okay, why did you do that? And there's a couple of examples of that, especially in the first half of the book.
That's really sloppy editing as much as anything, isn't it?
Right. There were a few things like that I didn't like very much. And then also when she got to the point where she was delving into religion and spirituality, which I'm not religious for the record, she got into this very kind of woo-woo kind of spiritual stuff that she started to get interested in. And I was just less interested in that. So
there might be some skimming required for the secular crowd like me.
Exactly.
Did reading this book make you want to trace your family tree, or did it make you want to run from ever finding out anything about your ancestors?
Probably neither. I did a little bit of genealogy stuff in the past, very kind of surface though. I didn't do a whole lot. And I've had my my DNA tested for like ethnic ancestry, which she mentions that in depth in here, which was really interesting. My DNA results, almost like 95%, I would say, matched up with what the family lore is as far as what our ethnicity is. So I thought that was interesting. So it's okay. I don't know if some of our family stories are also correct, but at least the ethnicity matched up. So that was interesting. So it didn't spur me either way, but I could see how it might spur some folks.
Let me close with an anecdote from my days in the genealogy circuit. Back in the day, this story was shared by a really prominent, if this is not an oxymoron, a prominent genealogist in Canada, who talked about, was one of somebody he met, that her great aunt always said that her great grandmother was the Duchess of Bedford. And so then somebody in the family finally set about doing the genealogical research and found out that the great-great-grandfather was a pub owner, and his pub was called the Duke of Bedford. So there was great-great-grandma slinging him down the bar, and she got the nickname the Duchess of Bedford.
That's outstanding.
So there's always there's often a germ of truth, but it may not be quite what you were expecting.
Right. I think that's a great story.
On that happy note, Holly, this is your first appearance on Bite Size Book Chats, but I hope it won't be your last.
I'd love to be back. Thank you.